Hello and welcome back to Simple Money Podcast, Canada's own personal finance podcast presented in short and informative episodes. I'm your host, Matthew Seawick, also known as the Friendly Financial Coach. And as many of you know, my background's in economics, and today I felt like I would go a little bit deeper into some of the larger economic forces that are in play in Canada. So hopefully this will be the first episode out of many where we look at larger topics that really affect us. And the topic that we'll be covering today is one that's really important. It's about how the job landscape has changed over the past nearly 4 decades in Canada. Many of the figures and data and stories that we hear actually comes from the States, so this one specifically focuses on how we're being impacted. And the data that I use from today's session starts from the early 80s and really runs up to where we are today, at an inflection point caused by the COVID-19 health crisis. So when we look at this data, what we see is that there are many large structural shifts that have unfolded since the early 1980s. The largest trends include the type of industries that we work in, the structure of these jobs, and changes to other areas like unionization and pensions. These changes are also all heavily affected by gender and age. So in the blog post for this episode, I'll also include a direct link to the Statistics Canada report that really helped motivate this episode. So the first big change that we see is one that we've heard about a lot, the loss of manufacturing jobs. This is due to many different reasons, including technological shifts, globalization, and even changing consumer preferences. Without going into these causes in detail, what we see is that there's a sharp drop for those that have been employed in the industry. Nearly 20% of the working population was employed in this sector in 1981. And the most recent data from 2019 shows that we're now sitting at about 10%. And this is obviously a massive drop, right? Once there was 1 in 5 people involved in manufacturing, and now there's only 1 in 10. When we dig into these statistics a little bit deeper, what we see is that the largest demographic that was affected by this shift was males aged between 25 and 34. And this group saw a shift of nearly 14% from manufacturing to other industries. And all of this really makes sense when we look at the actual economic activity of manufacturing. When we look at historic results, what we see is that since the 1960s, there's been a steady increase in output of around 2% per year until the early 2000s. At that point, manufacturing output really starts to stagnate. And then eventually there's a bottoming out when the Great Recession kicks in around 2007. And then since then, it's struggled to really make a comeback to where we are today, where it's been hammered again by COVID-19. When we look at the most up-to-date statistics, manufacturing output from April of this year is nearly 24% less than December of 1997, which is the starting date for the data set that I was using. Since April, the economy seems to be getting a little bit better, but this is of course a very frightening statistic, and economic activity can easily shift. And when we look at the job landscape for manufacturing, what we see is very similar to this data. There's a mild job loss in manufacturing until the early 2000s, which quickly accelerates after that point. So with the loss of all these jobs in manufacturing, the big question is, where did many of these people go, right? So what we see is that the shift away from aggregate employment in manufacturing was made to a variety of different industries, some varying by gender. However, both males and females have heavily moved into the professional, scientific, and technical fields. In looking at how the shifts affected each gender, what we see is that for females, there was a large shift to public administration, education, healthcare, and social services. It's also noted that there was a very large shift of around 6% of the total female workforce away from clerical work since 1989 due to technology. For men, the largest shift is actually to construction, retail trade, accommodation, and food services, with some of these shifts being more felt by younger males. And when we actually look at the job itself, we see that there are quite a few structural changes to work. So since 1981, the structure of these jobs has changed quite heavily. One of these changes is the reduction of jobs that are both permanent and full-time. This drop is most felt by men and younger females, with all working age men seeing a total workforce decline of over 6%. On the other hand, females over 35 actually saw an increase of around 5%. Now, it's really important to point out that even though that there were declines for males, the percentage of males working in full-time and permanent jobs is still over 10% higher than females. And we also see similar gender changes to median real hourly wages. For females, there was a 20% increase for those under 35 and 38% for those that are older. On the other hand, young males really saw no increase to their wages, and older men saw an increase of around 13%. Yet again, these changes are really narrowing workplace gender pay gaps. Males aged 25 to 34 have a real median hourly income that is still $2 more per hour than their counterpart females. This gap then grows to nearly $5 an hour for those aged 35 to 54. Another very large structural change to the employment landscape is the increased usage of the gig economy, which is basically independent contractors that perform short-term work. These positions can have lots of perks, but often lack work protection and other types of benefits. Studies have shown that the gig economy has increased from about 5.5% of the total workforce in 2005 to 8.2% in 2016, and we also estimate that it's drastically increased since then. Unfortunately, the gig economy is also associated with high worker turnover. It was found in the same study that roughly 50% of those in the gig economy did not stay for 1 year. And some of the other changes that we're seeing in the statistics is that the number of unionized jobs has also dramatically dropped. In 1981, about 38% of jobs were unionized, while in 2019 it dropped to 29%. And this drop was drastically felt by males, where unionized jobs dropped from approximately 20% for young men. The only demographic that saw an increase in unionization were females aged between 35 and 54. And this is generally attributed to their increased employment in healthcare, employment, and social services. Similarly, the changes to who has a pension also has drastically changed. And this is really no surprise. But the percentage of workers that have had pensions has declined since 1981. Over this time, we saw a reduction of around 7.5% for Canadians that had some sort of pension. These benefits most commonly include defined benefits plan, defined contribution plans, or group plans. And typically, the gold standard of pensions is called the defined benefit plan. And this is where we saw a very large drop. A drop of over 26% for males and just over 4% for females. Now, defined benefit plans are usually considered to be the best type of pension because in many cases you're guaranteed to receive a set pension amount when you retire. And the risk of the actual investments that underpin this pension and any type of shortfall is not the employee's concern. And to really explain this spread between males and females, defined benefits are most readily offered in education and healthcare fields now. And these are both industries that we've seen large increases in female employment. Now, this really leaves us to where we are today, a world with many uncertainties. No one really knows how the COVID-19 health crisis will impact the employment landscape, but many believe that it will speed up the transition to various types of technology that will likely increase the amount of automation and artificial intelligence. Arguments can be made for and against these types of technological changes. These are discussions that we're going to be putting off for today, but must not be taken lightly. Employment shifts are inevitable, and it's important that we have proper framework to support those that are affected by the transition, and that we learn from past transitions and failures that really came out of those. So that's it for today, but as always, thank you again for joining us in Simple Money. If you're enjoying the show, please consider sharing with your friend or rating us on whichever podcast provider you're using. You can reach me at info@ffcoach.ca. Take care and talk to you soon.